All right, well, thank you, Susan, and welcome everyone. This is our third and final session of our discussion of the book Whitewalling with our presenter, Nancy Losh. Today, as you can see, I hope you can all see this on your screen. We are going to be discussing Harlem on My Mind, which was an exhibit at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in 1969. And Nancy has prepared some wonderful context for our discussion today. So I will go ahead and turn it over to her at this point.
Thank you, Sarah. And again, I warn you, I have broken every rule on the PowerPoint hierarchy here. I have lots of text and it's in all caps. That wound up because of just the way the PowerPoint program ran. But at any rate, what I did was I have some images that are backup information just to set the tone. And then I have gone through a rather extensive outline of the whole article. And that's where all the heavy text is. And then I have some support images at the end of artists that were forgotten, as it were, during that time period. So jump in when you feel appropriate, or I can continue through the outline part and we can come back certainly to conversation. So next slide, please. So Lyndon Johnson and Richard Nixon were presidents during this time period. Lyndon was president up until 1969. So he was running the country during the lion's share of the planning process, and Nixon had literally just taken office. So next slide, please. What we know is that it was an extremely tumultuous time in this country, and when you look back, I was just astounded at what had actually, so much had gone on. And in 1968, this picture was taken just protesting at the Capitol, social crisis at home. The Vietnam War was raging. Next slide, please. And Martin Luther King was murdered. And of course, we had rioting in the streets. And shortly after Martin Luther King Johnson signed the Fair Housing Act, banning discrimination in housing on the basis of race, color, religion, and national origin. And that was the last bill that he signed. But also earlier in the summer, Bobby Kennedy was shot. On the positive side, we had the lunar landing. So it was enormously, and that's only a tiny bit of some of the things that were going on. Next slide, please. So this is the book that was published to accompany the show. Every major exhibit has a book, and it's always hard to get them published, but obviously the museum had plenty of money to do it. But at any rate, the idea of the exhibit was born in 1967, the brainchild of Thomas Hoving. He was recently installed as the director, and Alan Shaner, curator, who had previously worked at the Jewish Museum in New York and had successfully mounted a similar show on Jewish culture. So the difference, however, between the show he mounted at the Jewish Museum is that the Jewish Museum was about history. It was a very appropriate show for the location. The the Met is clearly an art museum, and you'll see where that plays in just a little bit. So the show was imagined as an effort to heal a festering racial divide in New York City, explicitly as a way to invite previously ignored Black and Brown audiences into the Met. And here we are 52 years later, talking about the same thing. But once again, we see now this was the first time, this was 69. This is the first of the 3 acts, by the way, that we that we're talking about here, but we see an art museum or institution attempting to heal through art and dialogue. I know art can heal, but it's interesting how major institutions sometimes stick their feet out and in the water and maybe shouldn't. So the exhibit opened in January 1969. Of course, it was 2 years in the making, and much went down during that process. As noted on page 109 of the article, the use of the term capital in the title here is a double entendre. It implies that the cultural source of Black America springs from Harlem, but in a more sinister way, the Met was trying to basically improve their own, line their own pockets by gaining more participation. So there, it was quite skeptical, as you'll see later on. The book plays a big role in it. Next slide, please. The book and this poster and a couple of other posters, which I didn't put in here, were part of the promotion press release, which I thought was very interesting, because this is a very artistically well done piece, but again, it's graphic design. Yeah, but it's a nice piece. So next slide, please. So here's a picture of Thomas Hoving and Alan Shaner. I think I have these switched. I think Alan Shaner's on the left and Hoving's on the right, but I could be wrong about this. But at any rate, as we learned, Sharon sent me a note last night that Shaner died on April 9th this year. I presume, oh, it didn't say, I don't want to assume that. But anyhow, in the article that she sent me, it noted that he was haunted to his dying day with this particular show. As we learned, he was literally forced out of New York, had to move from his home. He was being picketed. He really went to Vermont and sort of went off grid for a while with his family, ultimately winding up in San Francisco. I think it was San Francisco area. But he always wanted to get the story straight. And I do think either in this article or one of the 100 other articles that I read about it, he did have the opportunity to say that he did not intentionally keep Black art out of this show. He felt Black artists should be shown at the museum, but they just didn't fit into his show, his idea and his direction, and he didn't feel they were appropriate. I guess that's something to be judged as we go along. So next slide, please. So these are slides of the actual show. Shaner had done a similar show at the Jewish Museum. This is 1969. These kind of shows are very familiar to us today when we go to history museums, car museums, just the barrage of visual images and text and sound. There's always recordings going on, and they're beautiful. And they were, by the way, initiated in this concept of museum display was initiated by Ray and Charles Ames in 1963. I think it was the New York World's Fair. And I remember having gone to that and having to go in and see that presentation, because it was stunning. It was all around the room. It was beautiful. But at any rate, this is his presentation at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And you know, I guess when we think about what the museum, can you do the next slide? Sorry. can you do the next slide, please, Susan, when you get a chance? When we, oh, I shouldn't.
Unknown caller.
I have no idea what this is. Sorry. At any rate, here are two more images. Can you do the next slide, please? Here's another view of the show, and this is actually from the Metropolitan Museum of Art, an article on their archive page. Art and Design reviewed the show. What I learned from a disgraced art show a disgraced art show on Harlem. And the writer says, I'd also never seen an art show so much like a science museum display. I didn't know what to do with it. So I left thinking, what was this about? So, and I think that's an interesting point. So can we see the next slide, please? So I thought I'd start where I would start with running an organization or a department or a group or whatever, but you have a mission statement, and like every time you do something, you go back, does this meet my mission? And the Metropolitan Museum of Art collects, studies, conserves, and presents significant works of art across all times and cultures in order to connect people to creativity, knowledge, and ideas. So I want to keep that in mind, because art is the key here. What is art, I think, and how has the definition of art changed, perhaps? But can we go to the next slide? So given the mission, my question is, were their motives pure? Shainer's seems to be judged sincere, while Hoving's missions were considered opportunistic. Again, Hoving wanted to increase the numbers of attendance of Black and Brown populations. Shainer just wanted to put on his vision of what Harlem was. But it took a while to decide that Harlem was the right solution for this show, when they were trying to figure out how to address this audience and lack of participation. Another question I have is, would the show in any other location bring as much controversy? And I don't know, I guess that's something to be judged. So can we have the next slide, please? So the secondary issue is planning, the planning process. Harlem's community wanted to be part of the show, not the subject of the show. And as you'll see throughout the article, the people that were on the committees were offering ideas and suggestions, but were largely ignored. The catalog itself then generated controversy through the use of the term capital in the title and the opening introduction. So again, there'll be more on that in later slides. So can we have the next slide, please? This is where it gets heavy. The exhibition development timeline. So in 1967, Hoving recognized the need to better, I have to apologize. I don't know why whatever version we're showing shows the issue, but it's okay.
I might be able to fix that. Do you want me to take just a minute, since we have a small class, and see if I can just put it into a different view? It'll take about 60 seconds.
Yeah, it's up to you. Good. Yeah,
okay. Let me see what I can do. So
Nancy, while we're waiting, wasn't Hoving also wanting to get money? And if he had a black thing, he could get more money for all these buildings he wanted to create? I thought that was part of his um, investment too in this is financial.
Oh, he was going for grant money. Yeah, there was 3.5 million, I believe, that was up for grabs, and that played a role definitely at the end. Yeah.
I think we're all set if you want to
Good.
continue. I'm not sure which slide we should be on, but I think it's this one.
Exhibit development. Let's, can you back up one?
Yeah. Ah,
There, perfect. Okay. So he recognized that he wanted to better serve a larger demographic. So after meeting with Black clergy, he decided to focus on Harlem and do an exhibit on Harlem. And then Shaner came along as an outside consultant and curator, and he joined the planning process. And they intended to, they literally intended to shake up the things and undermine the hierarchy of which art was established, or the established art world operated under, and i.e. painting and sculpture was viewed as high art, and primarily forms of art, historically ignoring the applied arts, which would be photography, graphic design, printmaking, etc. So, and they were simply not covered or considered as art early on. And they both wanted to create that tension at the museum. So they also wanted to empower the visitor to engage in the artwork. So can you go to the next slide, please? Now, if anybody wants to jump in, please do. Although African artifacts were part of the collection, African artists were not. And that's just so unbelievable. It would also be the Met's first exhibition of featuring photography, although I argue that it wasn't featured as artwork. It was just used as a message, not viewed as a work of art during this show. In November 15th, 1967, Hoving held a press conference where he said the museum's role is simply that of a broker for channeling of ideas. You might say we are attempting to tune in on something we've been tuned out on, again, referencing the lack of participation from the Black and Brown communities, although it's expensive to go in, and it is a very imposing building, you have to admit. So the press release identified the Met as an arbiter of racial relations in a troubled time. At no time in the country's history has there been more urgent need for creative confrontation between white and Black communities than today. In the belief that the Metropolitan Museum of Art has a deep responsibility to help provide the opportunity for such an exchange, an exhibition of Harlem's rich and varied 60-year history as a cultural capital of Black America will be shown at the museum's major exhibition galleries. And that just sounds quite lovely and altruistic, doesn't it? Next slide, please. Paralleling the Met Show was the introduction of the Black Arts movement at that same time, and the creation of storefront galleries and collectives and nonprofits designed to meet the needs of Black community artists, including studio space, daycare, and education and outreach. And that was done specifically because the galleries were not allowing the Black artists into their exhibits and into their shows. So they decided to take it into their own hands. So feeling shut out of white institutions when curators of white institutions spoke of artistic quality, the Black artists heard, "You're not good enough. You do not belong here." Again, the curators in museums such as the Met act on behalf of the whole body of art, of the art community, but they do it based on what has previously been decided as high quality or good or acceptable. Every once in a while, we see challenging pieces come in, unique pieces from curators that begin conversations, and this is certainly one of them. Artistic quality was defined by Western culture, the white art community, as we all know. So next slide, please. Black art community was skeptical, believing that the true goal of the exhibit was to capitalize on a kind of radical chic circulating in New York at that time. Hoving was shocked that the Black community was not enthusiastic about this concept, particularly as the planning process was going on and information was getting out as to how it was proceeding. The Black community wanted more than inclusion. They wanted a seat at the table. They wanted to be in the show. In response to Shaner's assembled a research committee. Reginald McGee in charge of photography, Donald Harper, sound recordings, and Alelia Nelson, project administrator. Sharon, those were the people in that photo, in that article that you sent me. And I'm sorry I wasn't able to quickly get that in here, but we had enough going. So, but at any rate, these people were brought into the committee, and I think it's still all volunteer at this point. But it was a Black committee that he put together as time went on. Basically, he ignored them though. Next slide, please. So McGee and Harper were not even residents of Harlem, and that was a point of contention because they felt that their voice, they didn't walk the walk, they didn't know the journey. So that was an issue, even though they were Black Americans, African Americans. He also sought endorsement from the New York Human Rights Commission, which I believe he received, and ultimately received an enormous amount of money, which you'll see at the end, played a role in some of the decisions made. So as planning went on, both committees wrote letters expressing frustration, implying their suggestions were not being acted on. In August of 1968, Clark, one of the original members of the committee, wrote a letter to Romare Bearden, noting the trouble was that the project never belonged to them. While they offered many ideas, few were acted on. Wow. Primary issue was that no Black art was included in a show about Black Harlem. So, next slide, please. One room was dedicated to art, painting, and sculpture. It was called Portal to America. Shaner included it. Actually, he didn't make a big deal, and I don't know even who was in that room, but it was his opinion that it was the worst part of the show. It interrupted the flow, and it did not fit with his idea or his exhibit. So he did not like that portion. Years later, he admitted that the committee was there to provide him cover. And although he wasn't opposed to Black artists being shown at the Met, he did not feel it was appropriate to be included in the show. It was not his responsibility. Essentially, Hoving and Shaner viewed Harlem as a whole, as the whole work of art on display. So they viewed the entire community as art. And that's how they, in their minds, justified that it was art going into the museum. In January 1968, demands by the committee were made to cancel the show. And that was a year before the presentation. Give me the next slide, please. So calls for a parallel exhibit of Black arts went unheeded. Instead, a small show of Harlem's artwork of Harlem's school children was mounted. That's always a good way. Use the kids. So further complicating things was the Whitney show at the same time, titled The 1930s Painting and Sculpture in America, which did not include one Black artist. Counter exhibition at the Studio Museum in Harlem featured invisible Americans, Black artists of the 1930s. So again, the Black community is, we have the separate but equal thing that like we have in education. So if you're not going to let us be part of it, we'll do the same thing in our own way, which further drives the divide. And I think, in my opinion, November 22nd, 1968, at a press conference, Bearden, among others, announced with the withdrawal of the support for Harlem on My Mind, citing breakdown in communications. That's November. The show is to open in January. Can we have the next slide, please? So interestingly enough, 2 weeks before the show opened, Hoving called a meeting with leading artists and cultural figures in Harlem that did not go well. The next day, the formation of Black Emergency Cultural Coalition was announced. Years later, we saw that in action at the artist space with the Nigger drawings. That Emergency Cultural Coalition, I believe, is still in operation. The BECC called for cancellation of the show, for the appointment of Black professionals to policymaking and curatorial positions at the Met, and development of a more viable relationship with Harlem residents and Black community at large. Next slide, please. So the day before the show opened, the BECC began to picket the museum. It was a very small group. They felt very helpless, actually. They had no money, no influence, no entree into the imposing all white structure. And they felt that they weren't going to do much. But the police showed up and brought barricades and cordoned off the street. And it literally gave them their platform that they needed to get their message across. So their organization was cunning in that they chose a dark-skinned Black person to be their spokesperson, because they knew the media wanted militancy. The actual president of the organization was light-skinned, and they didn't feel they'd get as much coverage if they had a light-skinned individual speaking on their behalf. So, but they also threw people off the line that were calling for violence. Some people were actually calling for bombing the museum at the time. So they didn't want that. They really wanted entrance into the museum. So they wanted to do this right. Next slide, please. So the protests were gained followers, including some of New York's elite began protesting with them. And on January 16th, other protest groups showed up, including the Anti-Defamation League, the Jewish Defamation League, the American Jewish Congress, and the ultra-conservative John Birch Society, each independently protesting their own issue. And their issue was the catalog. The Jewish community was, they were protesting particularly the introduction. Shaner had originally been advised to have an authority on Harlem write the intro. Rather, he chose an unknown voice. Next slide, please. So the controversial introduction was written in 1967 when the show was first initiated by a young black woman by the name of Candace Van Ellison. She was a Negro girl, then 16, and a student at Theodore Roosevelt High School in the Bronx. In the intro, it suggested, according to Mayor Lindsay, that Black Americans have joined a national majority, not by their efforts for justice and dignity, but through this anti-Semitic feelings. Miss Ellison, now a sophomore when the show opened, she was a sophomore at Bridgeport University. She wrote, the already badly exploited Black was allowed to further be exploited by Jews. She alleged that behind every hurdle that the African American had yet to jump stands a Jew that had already cleared it. Can we have the next slide, please? So further, she wrote, psychologically, Blacks find that anti-Jew sentiments place them for once within a majority. Thus, our contempt for the Jew makes us feel more completely American in sharing a national prejudice. Shaner said there was no attempt to provoke anti-Semitic feelings and added that as a member of the New York Jewish community, he felt that the Jews must face the realities of the world in which we live. Can we have the next slide, please? So unknown was that Shaner had paraphrased Van Ellison's text. She had written an essay and he took the essay. She did not write it for him. She had written it for another reason. I forgot what it was, but he got a hold of her essay. He used her essay and took the text and attributed the thoughts to her when they actually were quotes from Nathan Glazer and Patrick Moynihan's book, The Negro Family. So the case for national action. So he removed the quotes and attributed the statements to her, which was rather unethical. This is just another example, I feel, of Shaner's demonstrating his implicit bias by using a Black person to promote his own political views of race. Mayor Lindsay demanded that the book be pulled. At first, they refused to do it, but after numerous threats of withdrawing $3.5 million in city funding, they acquiesced. Next slide, please. So ironically, the show gave prominence to the art of photography. It truly did raise photography to a new level. And photography is now among the high arts. And it also gave recognition to two photographers, well-deserved attention, but ignoring the committee's request to include the work of other accomplished practicing Black photographers from Harlem. The two photographers that were included in the show were literally just taking photos in a journalistic manner, not necessarily in an artistic manner. So one could argue that they weren't even honoring their work as artistic, purely as informational and journalistic. So next slide, please. So the question is, money, ethics, art, can museums police themselves? These are some images of the protesters. Tricky Tom is at it again. Okay, I believe next slide, I think I have a wrap up here. Whoops, nope, there's two more. In the end, 450,000 visitors over a 16-week period run compared to typically 50 to 60,000 for the show of this scale. So the museum felt that they were successful. The Met trustees announced the formation of a committee to study the cultural needs of New York community, not directly served by the Met. And that resulted in overseeing the establishment of the Bronx Museum. Sue, this might be somewhat what you're talking about. the Bronx Museum of the Arts, the Snug Harbor Cultural Center in Staten Island, and the Queens Center for Art and Culture. These were viewed both positively and negatively, good for the communities, but implied that the Met's doors were still not open to Blacks, that they would rather not have them on Fifth Avenue. Next slide, one more. Oh, two more. Well, this is just, and I don't want to read this. This is the press release on January 21st of the museum saying, oops, we fully recognize we made a mistake. And we're pulling the catalog. So the catalog, by the way, had been selling at 1,000 copies a day at something like $1.95. So they didn't want to pull it, but they ultimately did. It was reissued in 1995, I believe. Next slide. Parting thoughts from Harlem on whose mind, the Met and civil rights. One of the most positive outcomes of Harlem on my mind fiasco was dawning recognition on the part of the Met leaders in the 1970s that more voices and stories needed to be heard in its Fifth Avenue building. While art historians and critics have justifiably focused on the shortcomings and fallings of HOMM, locating its most significant and lasting impact in galvanizing artist protests, actual visitors to the 1969 exhibition have shared different perspectives. For example, the leading photography historian, Deborah Willis, credited the exhibition as an early shaping influence on her groundbreaking scholarship and on Black photographers, especially James Van Der Zee. James Van Der Zee, his work was in the show, but they didn't credit him and they didn't honor him at that time. But the subject of one of her he was the subject of one of her monographs. Similarly, contemporary photographer Dawood Bay has identified the show as the key source of inspiration for his own creative practice, as related in his 2015 TEDx talk at the Met. Art begins with an idea. He went to the Met as a curious teenager drawn by the protests and left with a passionate vocation. So interesting things happened. Can you move to the next slide? That's basically the rundown. These are the Harlem artists, just a few of them, and samples of their work that they did during this time period, within a couple of years, that had literally been ignored. Can you hit the next slide? So this is Romare Bearden. Romare Bearden is enormously accomplished artist, 3 folk musicians, very typical of his work. Next slide. Norman Lewis, The Players. He was an abstract expressionist. His work is very similar to this, but was showing in major galleries during that time. Next slide. Ernest Critchlow, People. It looks like Martin Luther King in there. Again, an accomplished artist, and was showing in some galleries at that time. Next slide. Roy DeCarava, Swimmers. Although this one was taken in 1950, he was actually on the committee, and Shana would not show his work of Harlem. Next slide. Benny Andrews, Down the Road. Really lovely painting. Next one. Faith Ringgold, the American People Series, number 20, Die, 1967. This is a painting, a very large. I think it's in 2 pieces, not a triptych. But this is contrary. Normally, well, I shouldn't say normally. She did a lot of quilt making. I think I showed that in the last one. So I wanted to show her paintings, one of her paintings, and this one, she was in, I forget what museum at this point, but Faith was very well known. Next slide. Cliff Joseph, the Superman, 1966. And next slide. And Vivian Brown in her studio in 1971. So these are the works of some of the people. I could have gone on all night finding images to share. So basically, that's it in a nutshell. I'd love to have your opinions and hear how you feel about any portion of it. Anybody?
Please go ahead and unmute yourselves. We've got a small group today, so it's fine to just go ahead and unmute and jump right in.
Well, I was so struck by page 145, the information about the catalog
Yeah,
that Hoving wrote.
yeah,
I mean, that was appalling.
yeah, yeah.
And if that was his attitude through all the planning process and all of this, I mean, he was not presenting to these committees how he really felt, it seems to me.
Yeah, anybody else?
It was pretty astonishing how clueless both Hoving and Shaner were. And, their advisory committees were telling them, and they kept kind of upping the protest within the committees.
Yeah.
And it just didn't get through. And they clearly just weren't listening. They were so focused on what they wanted to accomplish with this show. But why didn't they understand where this was headed? I mean, because there was a lot of protest out there in the environment already. Again, we'd had the March on Washington. We'd had all these, as you pointed out with your slides. There was a lot of environmental protests. Oh, they thought they were going to escape this and be able to just do their own thing without any backlashes. I suppose it's easy to say looking back on it, but they were told. And just
but the fact that he
agree. I kept feeling and reading it like it was Shaner's show. I mean, he made these pretenses of inviting other people to participate in committees. There were so many lost opportunities if he had actually listened to them.
Yeah.
But it was like he had tunnel vision, and this is what he was going to do, and the rest of it was just kind of for show. It was all about him and his vision. And
think back to the mission of the Met.
Yeah.
He was just, but I kept thinking, where were the trustees at this time? I mean, I've had to deal with the boards so much, where were they? They seem to have put their stamp of approval on it as it was going on.
But it's almost like they had blinders on.
Yeah.
This is how it had always been. And so this change they just weren't ready, basically, in their minds to move ahead. And even reading his obituary, you had the same impression.
Yeah. Yeah. I felt a little more sorry for him when I read his obituary, but not a lot.
But this really wasn't an art exhibit. This was really like you would do in a history museum or whatever. And I think they totally missed the point, because if it's an art exhibit, you exhibit artists. And this was really news journalism, a story about a place rather than creation of people living in the place. So I think they totally missed the boat on that. It just didn't fit, and they never got that.
Well, they had two missions. One was to shake up the hierarchy, which they certainly did. But the other was to bridge the divide through dialogue and art. Well, first of all, they didn't use any art. And I don't know what their dialogue was. They had no dialogue with their committee. They had so many false pretenses, and yet they were driven. And God knows I've seen that happen, where people just get so focused on what they want to do that nothing else can penetrate no other ideas can come in. So, but
The
this
pro-
And
is,
isn't there also sort of an elitism, or was at the time an elitism within the museum or within the art world, that the people like Hoving, they knew what was best, and that the community needed to be instructed, and he didn't need to listen to them. He was the one who knew what art was and what should be exhibited.
yeah. Mhm.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, Anne. And back to the thing about the catalog, what would be the process of doing that? I mean, would Hoving just write it and then it would go to print, or would it be reviewed by anybody? I mean, he made up the stories,
Yeah.
apparently, that he included, and, you know, stereotypes of a maid and a driver.
Yeah,
Um,
right. Yeah. Um, well, nobody did any research.
Okay.
They believed him. You know, they assumed he had a research committee. He had somebody on the committee that was in charge of research. But yeah, there should have been, Hoving had to read it. But I don't know if there was any checkpoints beyond that.
Yeah, it would seem not.
Yeah.
I see
Um,
whoever was doing the
go-
editing would have caught that and said, wait a minute, this is really subversive, controversial. Where does this come from? Did this 16-year-old really write this? I mean, that just huge.
Well, yeah, she wrote a lovely essay apparently, but but she used quotes. She wasn't generating those thoughts and ideas. And the poor young woman, he attributed to her. And I mean, that's just basically plagiarizing, I think, isn't it?
And really, didn't the subject matter of the introduction really not have anything to do with Harlem on my mind?
Yeah. Well, and I kept trying to find the entire piece. I didn't. I found snippets because there were so many articles. This show made, I think, probably numerous PhDs in art history. So many people wrote, and honestly, there were some I couldn't even access because I could have, but I didn't want to go through through our, would have had to go through the library to get the database, but it's just been I didn't. I mean, there was enough information that out there just on the general internet that an unbelievable amount of information generated on this show.
Nancy,
Yes.
after you read a lot of those articles and things,
Yeah.
was there like a general consensus on the motivation behind Hoving and
Yeah, that it was a failure, that it was wrong, that he did a disservice to the museum and to Harlem. And like I said, just those two little bits at the end where the one photography slowly became recognized. You know, there were some offshoots of it, but by and large, no. You know, how do you measure though enormously financial results? 450,000 people saw the show. And the committee, the BECC picketing, they were outraged because numerous Black families and schools were crossing the picket line to see the show, because they felt it was important for their kids to see that, or their families. But so financially it was a success. Numbers wise, it was a success, but context and idea, it was horrible. It was panned on every article I read. Every article.
I think it's so sad that they didn't acknowledge the photographers' names who did all of the work. I mean, that just seems a travesty. Here, if you put all of their work out there and never acknowledge who produced it, is just, it's hard to even imagine.
But think back, photography was not an art at the time. So even in his naive way, he wasn't ignoring it. He was ignoring it, but he not even, but I would say the museum probably supported that as well, because they didn't think photography was an art. So
But sometimes in newspapers and things, the photographer is noted at the bottom of some of these pictures. So it's not in the real world always ignored. I mean, if you
right,
have,
exactly. Yeah. There should have been some byline somewhere, you would think. Yeah. Yeah, he went on, his career was really damaged after this show. He was forced out of New York. His house was picketed, so he had to move out. He moved to Vermont with his family and farmed the land for a while, until he got another gig. I forgot what it was. But then he wound up going out to California. But he never did curate to that extent after that show. And he was a rising star. He was a young rising star at that time. I forget where he graduated, Yale or something, art history, and did quite a bit of work at a very young age that was really well done. But it wasn't in art museums. It was in like the Jewish Museum and a few other places. So, yeah. Hoving, by the way, stayed at the museum for quite some time after that. His career was not damaged to that degree.
Has the Met had any subsequent exhibitions of Black art?
Yes. Oh, yes. Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. And in fact, I can recall in the 80s, I spent quite a bit of time there when I was in various school, master's degree and whatever, having to do some research. And I know the Black artists were in there at the time, because I remember thinking we had to get over, we have to get over to see the Romare Bearden. And, I can remember those pieces being there. But like Sarah said, not a great deal. There's not a large presence in the museums.
In terms of what they've purchased, especially.
Yeah.
They just don't own a lot of Black art.
Right. Yeah, the articles that you sent, Sarah, one of them said that there a few museums were making major efforts to the point of selling off white artists so they could get money to buy Black artists, to beef up their collection.
Just going back to Crystal Bridges for a minute, just because it's a new museum, I think there's a great change in, well, even the way the museum is organized down there, in terms of showing the cultures and the diversity and so on. There's a huge emphasis on it in that particular museum. And I think the others have got huge collections by white artists, and to integrate these Black artists is going to take a long period of time to make it work, if you will.
Yeah. And how are they organized? As periods? If you recall what I showed you, the one artist was an abstract expressionist, but most of their work didn't fall into any one of the traditional categories either. So the art community has a difficult time figuring out what to do with some of these things. So Faith Ringgold has an enormous following, and particularly in education, by the way, in K-12. She's really popular. But her work is quilts. And I think one of your articles, Sarah, said there was a show in the South. I don't think it was the museum that you're talking. I don't think it was Walton's museum. It was in I don't know, Alabama or something like that. And there was an enormous fight with the trustees in that particular case because the curator wanted to do a Black quilt show. And the trustees said, well, you know, there are so many white artists that are out there that haven't been shown. How can you show a bunch of quilts from quilting ladies? And so just the attitudes are just so,
Yeah.
and that was fairly recent.
Yeah. Yeah, that built-in bias does really seem to be a factor. And it's frustrating. You know, I was thinking in the music world, orchestral auditions today, even now, are done behind a screen because they found that if the judges could see the musicians immediately, you know, they made some judgments that were not fair.
Right.
And they do think that that has helped make the orchestras more diverse, that it's essentially made the audition process fairer. And you almost wish that this could be done in the art world. It's a lot more difficult to hide the identities of the artists. And of course, their subject matter often tells who they are or what their experiences have been. But you kind of wish that there could be something like that so that you could eliminate some of that bias early on in the process and their artwork could be accepted for what it is.
One of the most unusual museums that I've been to, I hope others have been to also, in Philadelphia is the Barnes collection.
Oh, yes.
Which Barnes was quite the character. We could have an entire story, an entire class on him and his collection. But what is interesting about it is that the artwork is displayed on the walls with no little card to tell who the artist is or the subject matter. And in each room, there is a bench. And on the bench, there is a book which has reproductions of the artwork and tells the normal information that we would normally see on the wall. So you're basically going into a room full of art and you have no, you're just looking at the art. You're just appreciating the art without a bias as to who the artist might be.
Just not judging. Yeah.
Yes. And that's aside from the fact that it's just an absolutely marvelous collection. Anyone who has the chance to see it should definitely have the chance to take the
Well, and it's just
opportunity.
in a home, so you walk into a home.
It
That's
actually,
why-
Charlotte, of course, there have been
They moved it,
many
right.
issues. They've now moved it into a modern museum setting, and it's basically, it's an art school. And
Oh, in downtown?
speaking of Buddhism, originally he didn't even want it to be open to the public, and was sort of forced to, but it is an art school with somewhat more limited access than what most museums would have.
Is it the University School of the Arts?
No,
Oh, okay.
it's called it's the Barnes Foundation.
Right. And it's, in answer to your question, Nancy, it's just about 6 blocks from the Philadelphia Museum of Art.
Oh, okay.
And I saw it in both settings. I saw it in his home, and then I've seen the new museum. And the condition was they had to move each wall or each room exactly the way he had it. So the artwork was surrounded by metal works. So it's a combination of decorative arts and paintings.
Oh, interesting.
I think the one thing I want to mention too, the New York Times 2 weeks ago had an article on Alice Neal.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
White portraitist of Black people, but it was very saying that people didn't have an objection to her because she gave such natural portraitures and they were with so much emotion and feeling. But anyway, that's, if you have a chance, I think that was in the arts and arts section of the paper, but it was really interesting article about a white artist depicting Black African Americans, but doing it in such a naturalistic and a very appreciative way that it worked. And there wasn't all the controversy about it that some of the other people have had.
Well, you know, this event happened in 1969. the other ones were 1979 and 2017. I thought it was interesting that she juxtaposed the stories, starting with the most recent and ending with the oldest. I wonder if it would have how, I'm just the relationship between the three articles. The first two were, does a white person have the right to use the name or use the image? In this case, it was an entire community that was sort of abused in the display. It wasn't just one piece of art. I don't know. Was there some connection? I guess I'm trying to think of between the three articles.
And I think Neil was much earlier. I think she was in the 20s and 30s, maybe, if I have the dates right. I can't remember. Maybe one of you art people remember better. But anyway, it was everyday people. It wasn't a political statement. It was just picturing people in a very kind of an emotional setting. One was a mother and a child. Anyway, it was an interesting article, but that she was accepted doing the art at the time.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Wondered if some of you had gone to the exhibit a few months ago at the Kreisinger, where they had white artists and Black artists. Some were commentaries on the way Blacks are treated, and some were just, particularly the ones by Black artists, were this is life, this is our art, I thought they did a really good job at the Kreisinger on that.
I did not see that. No.
Charlotte, are you still here? Did you see that?
No,
Oh, I thought you were there. Okay.
I was there, but I was at the print and the surrealist.
Other side.
Okay, this was several months ago.
This was before
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was the one before.
We probably went with HASP and I don't remember.
Okay. Okay.
So do you think if this show had been put on in any other museum, it would have generated as much controversy?
No. I don't think so. I think it was the fact it was the Met.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And the location of the Met and Central Park and the whole neighborhood, if you will, in part. And the expectations when people walk in the Met originally. I think today that's changed, but.
I still think it's an imposing.
Oh, beautiful.
And can be intimidating to some people that, well, art in itself is intimidating, and many people walk in and see an abstract and say, you're trying to pull something on me and I'm out, so the effort to try to look inside the image and find out what's going on, is the next step you have to take. So to see how to look at art, how to view art. But yeah.
Have any of you been to the new Smithsonian African American History Museum?
No.
I'm wondering how the exhibits there compare to, say, what they were trying to do at the Met, because the Met, as Sue pointed out, it was really more of a historical or sociological study. That maybe I have not been to the Smithsonian African American History Museum yet, but Beverly, did you say you had?
Yeah, we've been there. It's set up as it's a cultural and history museum, so it's a lot more than strictly as an art museum. There's 5 different levels, and the lower 2 levels underground actually start back in the 1600s. And so it starts from the beginning. It's given in a chronological order of the history. As you work your way up to the highest 5th level, It shows the accomplishments of modern day. So it covers everything you can imagine, historically and artwork. And I mean, they get into the music. It just covers everything. So it isn't strictly as art. But again, it was done through a Black lens. And there's that's what I see back in the 60s there. I don't think, I might be wrong, but that was my era. I mean, and you had to add feminism into that too, Nancy.
Exactly.
But and I was at Columbia University for all the riots and all of that. But
Wow. Good for you.
it was an era where I don't think white people had a clue. I really don't.
No.
White privilege,
No.
white lens, there wasn't any of that going on. It just wasn't even part of the life. And I'm not saying everyone, I'm speaking in general terms, but so I can kind of, the Metropolitan, it just wouldn't even enter their mind. Lyndon Johnson's decisions, whether it be the welfare programs or whatever, it wasn't based on, they didn't ask any Black people what they needed. They decided what they needed. So it was, again, that whole, and it went on in the Catholic Church. I remember they had a document they put out after Vatican II, and it was about, I can't even remember the title of it. The American Catholic bishop put out a document, and it was about something about promise to them or us versus something like that. And I remember sitting in my theology class saying, well, who is them? They're talking about being together, but again, they're speaking of them as some separate entity than the human race. I mean, so it's everywhere. But back in the 60s, I just remember the whole era so well. It was just very different. And a lot of you ladies were there too. So it's a whole different lens, outlook on the world. And the blinders were definitely there.
In Detroit, there's an African history museum that's very close to the DIA, and I visited that about 2 years ago. And it's a mostly, I don't say with art, it's history and ethnicity and all kinds of things. And the other place that I've been is in Paris. There's a wonderful museum of all other cultures, and from island cultures to African American to whatever, all non-white cultures. And I don't know if anyone can remember the name of it, but anyway, it's a huge building. It's in a circle, and you keep going up in the floors, and it's kind of over near where oh, and this is what happens when you get to be a senior, you're just mind anyway. But it's a relatively new museum anyway, and it was very fascinating. I have a good friend that's kind of an art person, and we visited many museums together. But if you ever back in Paris again, that's an incredible one. Plus the one in Detroit, and other than white culture and history.
One in Detroit is on our campus.
Oh, is it really? Yeah, it's because when I went to the DIA, then I visited that museum at the same time. Yeah, it was beautiful.
And there's also the Jim Crow Museum up at Ferris State University in Big Rapids, which is not strictly art, but it's an amazing place to see, and I would highly recommend it to people.
Rudy, you worked for so many years on the East Coast. Did you visit the Metropolitan in New York and also?
Yep, to all. I've visited any museum extent. I've probably visited in some fashion, either in person or yes, I did.
Pretty much in person.
Yeah. Did you raise a question, Charlotte, or?
No, I just didn't hear you speak about your experience, and everyone else is telling.
Oh.
And I know that, well, you probably visited all the places we're talking about.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, you bet.
Rudy, did you go to the one in Washington, D.C., the new African American,
We have.
We, if you move over, if I can jump into the conversation. I just don't like being invisible while I'm talking. It's just too much of a power grab or something. we didn't see the whole museum, and that basically was because of,
The levels.
because I was kind of a little mobility challenged at the time. But we saw the two bottom floors as you're going up. And it was a.
I think I
spectac-
saw everything really.
You might have, but
Yes,
I
did.
did.
No, you did not. You were
I-
wheelchair,
I-
I think, were you?
Yes.
Yes.
And but I absolutely agree. It was utterly spectacular walk through history, those two bottom floors as you were trying to go up. And the building itself, of course, is a marvelous example of museum. But yes, oh, let me shut up. I'm not taking the class. I'm just lurking as his technical assistant and then getting sucked in listening.
It happens.
We're glad you're here. That's fine. Nancy, I have a question. At one point, our author says that Black artists wanted museums not just to be neutral forums, but mechanisms of power, active forces for racial justice. I may have paraphrased that a little bit, but they wanted transformation, not inclusion, or not merely inclusion, I think.
Right.
Do you is that current today as well, do you think? What is it?
I do think so. You mean is that the general belief of Black individuals or?
Well, Black artists in particular. I think
right.
the one they were part of their protest was that they wanted the exhibit to be more activist and to make a more compelling point about the need for racial justice.
Right.
And I don't know. I mean, are you still hearing that from Black artists today? At least
I am still
your
hearing.
contacts at College for Creative Studies, for instance.
Right. And one friend of mine, faculty member, has practiced in Chicago and Milwaukee and has had, is a constant advocate and for racial justice. And it always was frustrating, even within our organization, even within the school politics. She would identify things that I wouldn't see. And I always had to take a step back and say, how do you express this? So how do you bring this across without constantly being the needle in everybody's neck? She had a hard time being able to communicate what she felt and how she felt. But being in CCS is right downtown Detroit, there is a wonderful Black and wonderful art community. I mean, it's a place to be if you're an artist right now. If you're a painter, sculptor, go to Detroit. It's great. And the DIA does show and purchase local work of our faculty and whatnot. But yeah, Tiana Bowie. And I thought for a while of asking her to run this, but I know how busy she is. She's a printmaker by practice. And I really felt it would be difficult for her to jump in, particularly when we plan these things. We're so many months out that now, things are different on the horizon, actually, for the temperature is different, but although we just had the conviction, thank God, but now we have more and more, and it keeps popping up. So, but yeah, I think it's still there. I think it's still difficult. And I think they still want a greater voice. And one way to do it is through your art, but then you have to get your art to be recognized. And but then on the, as an instructor, she has to also back off and say, I'm teaching everybody, and I'm teaching, skills. So I have to, she has to also pay attention to that. So it's a difficult piece, but yeah. Yeah.
If I
And
can just,
go ahead.
sorry, Nan. No, I was just going to say, if I can back up a minute, I had to look something up. I just want to go back to the African American Museum at the Smithsonian in DC.
Yeah.
Lonnie Bunch is the gentleman that the Smithsonian hired away from the Chicago History Museum to establish that museum, because they saw the work he had done in Chicago in changing the Chicago History Museum from being truly white-centered. And he did an amazing job there, of course, as well as in Washington.
Yeah, I've heard him talk. My son and daughter-in-law, before they went to Florida, they were in DC, and we were out there numerous times, but they could never get us tickets because it was so new. And so we have yet to see it. They fortunately were able to see it before they went down, before they moved. So I really hope to see that someday.
I lived in Chicago for many years, and the Chicago History Museum had an exhibit of the African American folk artists that were from the 30s.
Mhm.
I'm sure he's a very popular man, and I cannot think of his name right now, but beautiful graphics. But that was when the museum was at North Avenue, or just kind of off North Avenue. Is that
Still there.
Yeah. Anyway, then that was probably in maybe the 70s or 80s, but that was a big deal at that point. Lots and lots of people went to see that. And does anybody remember? Can you think of who I'm talking about?
Yeah, Jacob Lawrence.
Yeah, that's Jacob Lawrence. That's who it was.
Okay.
It was a wonderful exhibit, and anyway, it had a lot of people going to the museum, and it was just an African American man, and it was talking about how his work was supported by the WPA during the 30s.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
It's so bad when you can't remember the name. Now, as soon as you say it, I can recognize it, but bringing it up myself is like, oh well.
Well, of the 3 articles, which one did you find most challenging, and which one did you like the best?
I found, I think the first one more controversial, and it what you mentioned before, the fact that she did them starting with the more recent and then going to the older. I wondered if I'd read them in a different order, would I have had a different reaction?
Exactly. I thought the same thing. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I actually thought it was smart of her to do it this way. The controversy was more, well, the subject matter was more difficult in the first one.
Well, and it was hard because you'd read it one way and then you'd read something else. Your opinion would keep I kept kind of switching, and I could see each perspective. And like I didn't ever end up with a concrete answer what was right and what was wrong. But you could see both people's viewpoint and how controversial it was, but not a right answer. Correct answer.
But reading this last one and realizing it was 1968, 69.
Yeah.
You get the decision-making, the processes they were familiar. And that's a long time ago, but putting it in that setting, I found it very interesting.
And on a personal note, and the last chapter, the last section, to see the name of Romare Bearden, immediately his painting at the DIA, it's Quilters, isn't it? His large painting at the DIA. It just made me smile and say, okay, well, that's where he was, and that was what he was representing.
Right, he was a Harlem artist, and that's
Mhm.
yeah, they were working in Harlem at that time. Yeah. Yeah.
Nancy, has anything um, controversial or like for Latino artists, Latinx artists, has that ever been brought out now, or is that
I think it's
becoming?
probably the next hurdle, and I think Asian artists, the same thing we're gonna have to deal with. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I think there is just locally, many, many, many years ago, in the 80s, early 80s, I had actually it was late 80s, I had a grant from the Kellogg Foundation, and I 150,000 to work with elementary schools along the shoreline here, and so I had 12 schools that I worked with. But Hope College was a gallery that I would take the kids to often. And we did one major event one time with the Days of the Dead. And the schools that I had schools in Zealand. I had hired teachers to do this. We had schools in Zealand, we had schools in Holland. I think that would go to the locally here. We also had Muskegon and we had St. Joe. But the schools in Holland and Zealand, we would take to the local museums here, and we did a special with the Days of the Dead. And I was warned that I had to be very careful with the kids that we not show them the skulls and the skeletons, and that was too much of a ritual, and it was not of their faith. And oh my, it was, I had so many hurdles to jump when I was working with some of that. And some of the parents, they were not happy. We had to get some sign-offs with many of the things, and to be very careful. So, but yeah, so the cultural belief systems of other cultures are not always well received and viewed properly, I guess I'll say, or viewed with an open mind, maybe, with some of our, and it's younger people too. And that kind of frightens me, that it's younger parents. So, but that was quite a while ago.
That's interesting because it's such a family-oriented holiday.
I know.
Or observance in Mexico. Yeah.
Celebrating the the family and the death, and but
just a bubble.
Yeah.
A bubble here.
Yeah.
Do you remember the controversy about the mural on the side of the?
Yes, I do. And the art, unfortunately, he's passed on, but I do. I remember that. I knew him very well. So, there were. I think we have all that ahead of us yet. We have to take a look at that. So,
yeah, I
I
looked
was
up
thinking of Rivera, I'm sorry, the Rivera mural there at the DIA. When
yeah,
that
yeah.
was that,
Have you
I mean,
have you looked at that really well? It has wonderful pieces in it. I love it. Yeah.
Yeah, that stirred things up a little bit.
Yes, it certainly did. Yeah. Yeah. But I think it's with every year, now they had the oh, I don't know, recently somebody posted something, what's his wife's name? Frida
Kahlo.
Yeah, Frida. There was a picture of her standing in front of her. It was an article in the newspaper. Somebody had posted it recently, a friend of mine. And she was standing in front of her easel painting, and the headline was something about his wife dabbles in art while he works on No.
That always to me is such a wonderful story that Blue Collar Detroit was able to save this masterpiece when the elite art world of New York City painted his over for his political beliefs and subject matter.
Thank the Ford family for that.
Yes,
Amazing.
Yeah.
yes.
Yeah, in recent years, the Herrick Library and the museum and the Arts Council have all done things with Day of the Dead. And I
Yes.
think some of that controversy has probably gone away.
Yeah, I think it's becoming much more with the festival now. They're
Tulipanes?
yeah, I think it's becoming much more acceptable and understandable in the community. But in the back in the early 90s is when I did it. It was not as well understood. I don't think so.
I did look up that museum in France, and it's the Branly Museum, and it's Indigenous and Cultural Art of Africa, Asia, and Oceania in the Americas. So it's only in Indigenous and African art. So it's really a fascinating place, and it goes from culture to culture in a kind of a circular thing. So anyway, wonderful. Visit.
Sounds wonderful.
Yeah, it started in 2006, and it's called Musée du Quai Branly. Anyway, it certainly takes place. It's a totally different outlook than what we see in most museums, art museums.
I've got a couple things here. We're almost out of time, but I'd be curious to know if we could find a similar book about other interesting issues in art. Would you be interested in doing another book discussion? That would be a little bit, this has been a bit of a departure for the Fine Arts Committee and has to do this, but I think it's been a wonderful discussion and gives us a little extra dimension in our programming. And it's been very educational for me, certainly. So, okay, if you have any thoughts about books that would be appropriate, I'd love to have them. Again, you can just send them to me. I'm in the Hess directory, so.
I wanted to mention that I'm in the process of setting out evaluations, which will have a comment area. And so you're welcome to put suggestions in that area for future topics. And Sarah will have access to that, or just contact her directly.
Yeah, thank you.
Sarah, there's quite a movement now about looking at classical music and music studies more broadly, and including the music of other cultures rather than just European. And Deb De La Torre, whose husband used to be on the faculty here, is one of the people involved in that.
Ah, okay. Yeah, I'd love to have that name. So go
okay.
Put that on the evaluation if you would, Anne. Thank you. And I did want to point out too that on Wednesday this week at 1, Ricky Levine from the Holland Museum is doing a presentation. She's talking about the Matthias Alten exhibit there now, but is also going to introduce the LAUP exhibit that's coming up. And she also will be doing a course for us this summer about that exhibit. So a more in detail presentation on that exhibit. With that exhibit, the LAUP one will open, I think, in mid-August. So just keep an eye out for that too. And we'll do a course. And of course, you may want to visit the exhibit as well, since the museum is open. So, well, thank you, everyone. We are at 2:30, and so we'll wrap up, but I imagine Nancy's willing to stick around for a few minutes if you have other questions or comments for her. But thank you. And let's thank Nancy in particular for leading our discussion. It's been very enlightening. So thanks for all your participation as well.
Really
That's
good.
what makes a good discussion. So
Thanks.
we appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you
so much.
Thank you so much. It was great.
Good.
Very interesting.
We were left with many questions unanswered, but it was certainly an interesting discussion.
Well, that's good. It's room to grow.
Thanks.
Great. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Nancy, thank you again on behalf of HASP. It was wonderful. And if there are no other comments or questions, I'll go ahead and stop the